Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sree's Daily Global COVID-19 Show. My name is Sree Sreenivasan, and it's my honor to convene this daily conversation around various aspects of COVID-19. We talk about the health crisis, the financial crisis, and the inequality crisis. And we'll get to talk about all three of those topics in today's very special episode. We're episode number 217 in 217 days. Our topic, nonprofits, COVID, and racism. Our special guest, Deepa Iyer, Director of Building Movement, an attorney and civil rights activist. The Building Movement Project's report on the Frontlines, nonprofits led by people of color confront COVID-19 and structural racism, shines a spotlight on how 2020 social upheavals are affecting people of color-led nonprofit organizations. You can read that report at the URL you see on the screen, bit.ly/nonprofitsreport, bit.ly/nonprofitsreport. We'll talk about the report, we'll talk about the work of the Building Movement Project, and much more. Please tell us where you're watching from. You'll meet Deepa in just a couple of minutes. Hi, everyone. I'm Sree. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your support of this show. I'm the Marshall Loeb Visiting Professor of Digital Innovation at the Stony Brook School of Journalism and the co-founder of Digimentors, a social, digital, and virtual events consulting company. Our motto, don't cancel your physical event without talking to us, and let us geek out with you and talk about virtual events and help you plan yours. We've done events for 50 people and events for 100,000 people. We've done events with more than 30 heads of state and events with ordinary people. We would love to work on any kind of project with you. So please get in touch. You see my email address right here, and just tell me you want to talk virtual events. If you haven't seen this show before, this is what we do. In our first 215 episodes, we've had more than 1 million viewers, 156 million social impressions, 386 guests, 228 of them have been women. And we've had guests from 68 cities and 20 countries, including the chief scientist of the World Health Organization. You can find all our archives at youtube.com/Sreenet. Please give us a subscribe there. And we're in partnership with Scroll Global and Scroll.in. Please check them out. And a big thank you to our sponsors who make this possible. And a bigger thank you to our producers, Rose Horowitz at Rose Horowitz 31 and Vandana Menon, Vandana_Menon, who work very hard to bring you this show. So please tag your friends right now. We're live on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, and on LinkedIn. And your friends can watch live or later. So please share this with them now. We're talking about so many important topics right now, and you're going to get to meet Deepa Iyer as we talk about these issues. So I'm pleased to bring my friend of a few years, I'd say, to protect both our ages. We will just say just a few years. Deepa Iyer is Director of Building Movement, and we're going to talk about this report on the Frontlines, nonprofits led by people of color confront COVID-19 and structural racism. So please welcome everyone, Deepa Iyer. Hi, Deepa.
Hi, how are you?
It's good so we've known each other for 5 years or so, roughly, right?
We can go with that. We'll go with that.
That's it's just a pleasure to see you again and to chat about this very important topic. I should point out that you were the very first person to tell me way back in April, early May, that there's a problem with the way that COVID is unfolding in America, that the data is showing that it's far disproportionately affecting people of color. And I never forgot that you were the first to point that out. You did one of the first events around this, and you and your friends and colleagues in many different organizations really focused on that. And thank you for bringing attention. Now everybody knows this, but back then it wasn't so obvious. So we're very grateful to you for doing that.
Thanks so much, Sree. It's great to be here with you. I'm so impressed that you all have been doing these shows for, what did you say, 217 episodes. So congratulations on that. And also thanks to Rose and thanks to Vandana as well. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. And one of the things I always ask first is, how are you? Where are you? And how's your family handling the pandemic?
Oh, thanks for asking. Well, I'm based in the DC area, and I'm doing as well as can be expected given everything that is transpiring around us. But definitely facing some ups and downs, working from home, parenting a 10-year-old child. And I know your kids are older, but it is something that, requires a lot of patience and a lot of multitasking. But happy to be able to do this work in this moment right now to uplift the voices and experiences of communities of color who are dealing with this pandemic and other crises and upheavals in this very significant year that we're in.
Yeah, and we can trade stories about if it's harder to manage the 10-year-olds or the 17-year-olds. We'll talk about that another time. But let's get right to this project and this important work. First, tell us a little bit about Building Movement Project, and then we'll go into this report.
Yes. So I am the director of movement building at the Building Movement Project. It is a national nonprofit. It has 2 amazing co-directors and wonderful staff. It is an organization that seeks to strengthen individuals, organizations, and networks that are really committed to social change. And we do that through a variety of strategies, through research and reports and documentation, through convenings, through narrative change and trainings and resources. So that is what we do. And this particular report that you alluded to on the Frontlines really seeks to share information in terms of data, but also to place a spotlight on communities of color and people of color-led nonprofits, usually not a sector that you hear about often. So we really strove to lift up their experiences in this particular year.
So you are focused specifically on nonprofits that are led by people of color. So first of all, what kind of data do you have on how many there are? Talk about that a little bit. And what about people who lead, who are people of color who lead nonprofits that aren't specifically about people of color? Are they also included, or were you focused on ones that are working on issues around people of color?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as you likely know, the nonprofit sector is the 3rd largest employer in the United States. And in this particular instance, we were focused on nonprofits led by people of color that are particularly working with communities of color. And the reason for that is what you started off talking about, really. I think COVID-19 was a racial reveal for a lot of people. It exposed the structural inequities that have existed for generations when it comes to communities of color, their access to healthcare, their access to jobs, their access to food and healthy foods. We who work in these communities have known for generations that there is structural inequity, right? And so COVID-19 exacerbated that. And as you mentioned, there has been a disproportionate impact on communities of color. And so we wanted to really look at the people that are closest to those communities of color. These are health and human service organizations. These are organizations that are providing assistance in terms of food pantries, or that are dealing with domestic violence situations, that are providing educational benefits for young people. There are also organizations that are advocates, so that are really working to make sure that policymakers recognize the effects of the pandemic and other structural inequities on communities of color. And they're organizers. They're doing civic engagement work. They're doing GOTV work. They are organizing their members. So we wanted to really understand their perspectives because they're closest to the communities who are experiencing the brunt of this pandemic.
And so tell us how you put the project together, and we'll also take a look at the page itself. There's a website that people can get to and see the report. So we'll show that report right now, but go ahead and tell us about the methodology for this. Yeah.
So the methodology was that we had an online survey that was completed by 433 heads of nonprofits all around the country. And then we did 40 plus one-on-one interviews with nonprofit leaders as well. And we found that in many of these nonprofits are actually already under-resourced to begin with. They have less than 10 staff members. Most of them are working with budgets under $1 million. So it's not as though that they were completely prepared, right, when the pandemic hit. And so as you'll see on this page, some of the stats that I can tell you about, and then I'll talk about the findings. We found that 87% of people of color-led nonprofits are working in communities that are hardest hit by one or more aspects of the economic crisis, just as this slide shows here. So this would be people losing jobs, people who have been affected by COVID-19 in terms of illness and death, people who don't have access to housing, who are being evicted. So 87% of the people we surveyed are working in communities hardest hit by this particular crisis. We also found...
Just pause there. It's such good data. If we can just go back to that particular one, 87% of people of color, leaders of people of color are working in communities that are hit hard. So that's a disproportionate amount of the burden for them to not just keep their organizations alive and going, but in communities where they may not have as many resources. So that makes it even more difficult. We know that nonprofit sector is difficult to work in any day, even if you have a lot of money and are very well resourced. So these folks have it really tough.
You're absolutely right. And what is kind of overlaid on that is that government is not doing its job properly, right? So when you have government agencies that are actually not providing services, I mean, you think about, for example, Asian American communities, right? We have larger segments within Asian American communities that are not proficient or who have limited proficiency in English. So when public health information is provided only in English, that means that these communities are unable to access that information, whether it's around social distancing or remote work or anything of that nature. So these organizations have stepped in. They have become, in many ways, multilingual information hubs, translating information for their communities. They have become the ones that are filling the gaps that government is leaving behind. So you're absolutely right in terms of how nonprofits led by people of color have had to shift and pivot in order to make sure that they're attending to the needs of these communities that have been so affected.
Thank you. That looks, that's so important to understand this. So I interrupted you, but thank you for digging into that.
Yeah, of course. And then I guess another point that I would quickly mention, you see here 2/3 of people of color-led nonprofits are working with communities that don't have stable housing. So as we think about the eviction moratorium that's in place right now, which could be lifted, you're talking again about nonprofits that are trying to figure out how to help their community members who are talking about eviction being on the horizon, who can't pay their rent because they've lost their jobs, right? And so these are organizations that are on the front lines. They are the crisis responders. They are the frontline responders. Another data point that I thought you might be interested in particularly is that we found that 43% of these organizations are reporting that their community members are facing an increased level of harassment and violence. And so this is really prominent, particularly among Asian American and Latinx serving organizations. I think you may have covered this already, that a lot of Asian Americans are reporting a surge when it comes to violence and harassment, right? And that is because of the nationwide surge that we've seen targeting this community because of the scapegoating of China and Chinese Americans from the highest levels of our government. So as one of the community leaders we talked to said, in the middle of responding to COVID, we are also dealing with racism, bigotry, and Islamophobia.
It's so hard for people to understand what extra pressure this is adding to them. Any other numbers you want to show us now? Otherwise, I
think the only other one I'll quickly mention is that 3/4 of people of color leaders that we surveyed were observing increased levels of mental health consequences. And I think we're seeing this now in the headlines, right? That 7 months into this pandemic, the social isolation, the fact that a lot of communities of color are dealing with death and illness and seeing it in their own families, right? We know, for example, among Black and Native communities in particular, 2 to 5 times higher than among white populations are their infection case rates and their hospitalizations and death rates. Takes a toll. And so we're seeing that the mental health consequences are also on the rise.
Yeah, and I hope that is there a place for them to get extra help and things like that? What's available?
Well, a lot of nonprofits are providing some of that help with hotlines and mental health services. But again, it really underscores the need for us as a country to recognize that mental health is a public health crisis in this country, right? And there really need to be government services and access to mental health care, so that it is not seen as a stigma and that it's something that everybody has access to.
And so we hope that they're able to get that, and you would suggest prioritizing that, of course. So we have some these nice flip cards on the website. So let me try to make them a little bigger so that we can look at them. So let's start with right there.
Yeah. Well, before I get there, I just wanted to quickly go over some of the findings. You know, the data said one thing, right? But we also, of course, made some findings, and those are right up on the top there. Yep, you're scrolling up there. And the findings are in kind of a dark maroon. And what we found is that nonprofit community leaders are really clear that the crisis is going to get worse. So when they looked at, when we asked them, what do you anticipate 3 to 6 months down the line, they mentioned food insecurity. You know that from the long lines that we're seeing, right, at food pantry banks, for example. So food insecurity is coming up as a big issue. Housing instability is coming up as a big issue. Mental health is coming up. In addition, we're finding that people are concerned about voter suppression related to COVID, being able to vote. So there are a number of different concerns that people talked about in terms of this crisis. It's not ending. It is going to be a crisis that has implications for years ahead. Another one that we found is around women of color leaders. We found that they are actually experiencing an immense toll at a personal and psychological and emotional level of leading their organizations right now in this time of crisis. And then a last one I'll quickly mention is that despite the crisis, right, people also understand that this is a time for systemic change, that there's no going back to normal, as many of the people we talked to said. Normal didn't work anyway for people of color. There's no going back. And so there is an opportunity now, not just because of the pandemic, but also because of the uprisings that we saw against anti-Black racism. There's an opportunity for solidarity. There's an opportunity for systemic change and policy change that people really wanted to identify.
So you are being a little more hopeful than many people would be with this. And we want to also see some of the specific suggestions you have and steps. So we'll show those. We'll come to those in just a minute. First, let me just tell everyone to please tell us where you're watching from. Please share your comments. We're talking to Deepa Iyer, and I'm learning a lot, as I know you will, of course, about this report. It's called On the Frontlines, and it's really focused on nonprofits that are led by people of color. And as she has documented already, the stats are very clear that leaders who are people of color are working in harder circumstances, and then extra pressure is being put on them. And then if you're a woman who's a leader of color, person of color in a organization, you're having even more pressure put on you, and we'll talk about that. Let's see who are all watching. Neil Parekh, who's our Vice President of Events and Comms, is watching, and looking forward to hearing from my friend Deepa Iyer, listening from Springfield, Virginia. He guest hosted my New York Times read-along when he interviewed you, and it was a fantastic conversation. And
yes,
you made many people who already knew you learned more about you, and then people who had no idea about your work were so impressed. So it was great to see. Apollo is watching from New Jersey. He's just popping by, he said, while he's working. So thank you, Apollo. He's now in New Jersey. He was in Las Vegas, and I've been asking everybody to give us a quick Vegas story that is shareable with the public.
Are you serious? That's my cue?
Yes.
I don't think
that means you've got a lot of good
Vegas
stories. I think it's you've got.
I
a
don't
lot
think
of
you can
stories.
share Vegas stories, Sree. That's the point of Vegas, right?
All right, I should just.
I take the fifth on that one.
All right, okay. There's a lawyer there taking the fifth. Okay. Charles is watching from Chicago. Tell us a Chicago story.
A Chicago. Well, you know, I was hoping you would pick up the person who's watching from my place of birth. I can tell you that story.
Where's that?
Sree. From TVM, presume that is Trivandrum.
Oh, I didn't know you were born in Toronto. Oh, wow. Okay, so we'll get to. But tell us, and I presume you're not traveling. So, what do you miss about Chicago?
Well, one of my best friends lives in Chicago, and I miss visiting people that I know there, and really miss visiting Chicago in the summer. Not a big winter fan.
Yes. I said to someone, Chicago's got great weather 6 months a year. They said maybe about 4 is probably the right number. I'll just say hi to Charlie and say Charlie's not just a loyal viewer from New Jersey or from Chicago. He's also a sponsor of the show, and his book is right here, The Inventor in You by Charles Cunnincarroll, a step-by-step guide to your first invention. Let's see who else is watching. Jonathan Borstein has watched 217 episodes in a row, and he's watching from the East Village, and Ellen's watching from New York City, and Ashok is watching from Trivandrum, Kerala. So go ahead and tell us something about Kerala or Trivandrum.
Well, yes, I was born and raised in Trivandrum. And yes, hi to Mr. Cherian, who's watching from Trivandrum. My family's from Trivandrum. I have a lot of family members there. I lived there till I was 12 years old. So it is a place that is very dear to my heart, and I miss it very much.
Wow, that is incredible. I did not. We've known each other.
You didn't know that?
Oh. I did not make that connection. So we'll talk offline about it. Paula says, I've been a Deepa Iyer fan since she was on the New York Times read along. It's wonderful. Pradnya Haldipur says, greetings from Silver Spring, Maryland. Kisley is saying hello. And Neil says, Deepa is such an important voice for change. Thank you for joining us this evening. And Pradnya says, extra pressure on women of color in nonprofits. Yes, that's a thing. And Pradnya is just tagging friends, and we really appreciate when she does that. And Cherry says hi to you also. And to everyone, just tag a friend who can watch this later, even if they can't watch this live. And Neil says, what Pradnya said, women of color in nonprofits really have this extra set of issues that they have to deal with. It's sort of like being on Twitter, right? Like there are all kinds of extra problems you have if you're a woman or a woman of color. You're targeted, and it's so bad that it happens online, but it also happens with nonprofits, and that's hard to kind of think about. But let's talk about some of the ways in which you have identified things that people can do. So let's go back to the report, and you have these nice flip cards. So where do you want to go first? Recommend systems and policy?
Yeah, we can talk about systems and policy change. And I think one of the things I also wanted to make clear is that, the recommendations are not only for nonprofits or people who work in nonprofits, right? Every single one of us is connected to nonprofit services in some way. We are donors, or we are supporters. We serve on boards. We work there. So just to make clear that these recommendations are broad. So the systems and policy change one really came up because so many of the people that we were speaking to were talking about the need for, as I said, structural change, that this is the moment. So some of those include providing universal access to healthcare, right, particularly in a pandemic. They include that Congress needs to continue making relief packages available, which is something they keep stalling on, particularly to include vulnerable communities of color who are being disproportionately affected, undocumented people. And undocumented people have routinely been left out of these packages, these relief packages, which again, as you said, Sree, adds to what these nonprofits are doing, because they work with a number of large segments of undocumented people, right? Another piece is around digital literacy, which I know is close to your heart, Sree. The importance of providing access to technology and education. I was just talking with a number of nonprofit leaders in New Mexico today about this report, and they mentioned that there are so many spots across New Mexico where there is literally no broadband access, particularly when you think about areas that are where Native Americans are living, whether it's reservations or any sort of areas where you have urban Indians even. And so the importance of providing digital literacy and access is another systemic issue. And then lastly, safeguarding the rights of workers. We obviously know that a lot of people, especially from communities of color, work as essential workers. So do they have PPE equipment? Do they have the ability to actually keep their jobs? Do they have access to sick leave, etc.? So those are just some of the many systemic and policy changes that the nonprofit leaders of color that we spoke to wanted to highlight and lift up.
Rick says, in addition to food insecurities, voter insecurity will disproportionately affect minorities and vulnerable communities. Are these orgs encouraging and helping people to vote?
Yes, so that's a great question, Rick. And voting came up when we asked these nonprofit leaders, what are some of the concerns you have over the next 3 to 6 months? Voting naturally came up. And the question there was, how are people going to vote in the midst of a pandemic? Are they going to be able to go to and stand in these long lines that we're seeing, right? Will their ballots, if they're mail-in ballots, actually count? Will there be voter suppression, as there historically has been in communities of color? Those were questions that came up. And many of these organizations are indeed involved in civic engagement, voter registration, those sorts of efforts. But I will tell you that, you know, a lot of the organizations that do that kind of work mention that it is very difficult for them to do it. You know, if you work in a community of color, if you work in immigrant communities, you're an immigrant yourself, you know, we know that the way that we organize is person to person, right? We come together, we sit together, we eat together. And a lot of these organizations, that's how they organize and mobilize. And because of the pandemic and social distancing, it's very difficult to do that. So how do you organize over Zoom? How do you organize over text messages and WhatsApp? These are all new strategies that these nonprofits have been trying to figure out.
Thank you for that. Pradnya says, New America think tank is doing some important work on broadband access. And we have someone else from Kerala watching. Ashok says, NGOs or nonprofits in Kerala are also facing similar situations. We have a music group here called the MBS Youth Choir, which popularizes national integration songs in different Indian languages. We're planning to teach songs to children through videos sent through online. So these are all kind of global issues and global problems that people are dealing with. Are you surprised how international the issues are here?
Not at all. Not at all. I actually, I do a podcast called Solidarity Is This, and the last episode we did actually featured an activist working in Ireland and an activist working in South Africa. And what I learned from them is in exactly what, you know, the last person also mentioned, that these issues around structural inequity are around the world. They're around the globe, right? So if you are poor, if you are living in rural communities, if you don't have access to English, if you don't have access to the digital world, if you don't have access to a computer, this pandemic is hitting you more. If you don't have access to clean water, right? How are you supposed to wash your hands? So these are everyday questions that have been exacerbated, especially among those who are poor, who have little access to basic services. And that's why, you know, I think it's really important for the structural change part, right? We can't make these incremental changes here and there to fix the system. In many cases, our systems have to be completely dismantled, and we have to start over with an eye towards the ways in which race, where you live, your economic status all have a role to play in whether or not you're able to access basic benefits or get healthy food on the table.
One of this, what you're saying echoes exactly what Sapphire, the author of the novel Push that became the Oscar-winning film Precious, she was on our show very early, and she said that we are on, you know, everyone's on TV saying wash your hands, but in many Native American communities, there's no running water. And so what are you talking about, wash your hands, right? So that's exactly what you just mentioned. And it's tragic to hear that it's still going on, and it's a systemic problem and something that we all need to look at. We've put on the screen right now the link to the report, bit.ly/COVID-POC. So you can take a look at that. And that's those pages that we were showing you. We also have some comments coming in. Sharmila Rao Tucker is here. Great to see you here, Deepa. Been sharing the report widely. Thanks for the heads up, Pradnya. This is important work, and leaders like Deepa and her voice are so critical to bringing about the change we need in so many places. Grateful for your tireless and courageous work. So
thanks, Sharmila. Same to you.
Sharmila is also an amazing leader, and Sharmila, we have to have you on our show as well. But knowing you, Deepa, this is an opportunity for you that you'll want to give a shout out to your colleagues and your team.
Yeah, absolutely. So, would
Let's see.
love for folks to reach out and take a look at Building Movement Project and our work. There is a lot of information on our website, buildingmovement.org. You can find us on Twitter, on Instagram. So please check out our resources, our trainings, and our tools for your own work.
That's great. So everybody, please do that. And Pradnya is asking if we can we access the report via the South Asian Philanthropy Project? So she's asking Sharmila, actually. So that's a conversation going on in Facebook. And Sanjay is sending gratitude, and Pradnya is tagging people. I think that is so important when that happens, that people are tagging and sharing this. So let's go back. You had a couple of other suggestions in there. So we're going back to the report, and in that report, you first showed us the systemic changes, and now recommendations for philanthropy and recommendations for the nonprofit sector. You pick where you want to go.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think with philanthropy, I think that might be a good one. Obviously, we looked at not just the people of color-led organizations, but the stakeholders, right? So we first talked about policymakers and systemic change, and we also wanted to look at philanthropy. And what we found is that philanthropy, and so when I talk about philanthropy, it's a range of things. It's public foundations, right? It could be government contracts. It is earned income. It is private individual donors. So it's a range of different types of philanthropy sources that we're talking about. But we had some specific recommendations for public foundations. And that is that they really need to commit to supporting Black-led and people of color-led organizations, not just for, the next 6 months, but for the long run. And this might mean that they are actually giving above their 5% payout, which is usually what they end up doing. We also are calling on them to take a look at their commitments. As you know this, Sree, right? A lot of folks in various sectors, from corporate sector to nonprofit to many others, education, are really talking about their commitment to racial equity. And we've seen this even more in the wake of the uprisings this summer. So the question is, how are you balancing and aligning that internal commitment at your organization or your foundation to racial equity with how you're investing in these organizations, right? There has to be an alignment there. And then lastly, we also urge philanthropy to invest in people of color leaders. These are people, as we mentioned earlier, who are going through trauma, who are dealing with fatigue, who are balancing their own challenges in their lives while they are taking care of their community members. And it's so important that we don't end up having a whole swath of people of color leaders who are burnt out and that leave our sector after this crisis. So the importance of sustaining them for the long run. So whether that means to providing wellness grants, or whether it's to make sure that an organization has its healthcare taken care of and access to mental health, whether it is that there are fellowships and sabbaticals in place for people of color leaders. We really wanted to encourage philanthropy to think creatively about supporting the sector, the organizations, and the leaders. Because when these organizations thrive, the communities that they're closest to will also thrive.
Very well put, and so important. So those are recommendations for philanthropy. Now let's talk to recommendations for the nonprofit sector itself.
Yeah, so with the nonprofit sector, some of those recommendations are really about what are you doing inside the organization. So we found, for example, that a lot of nonprofits led by people of color are taking into account the impact of this climate. So they are reducing the work week for their staff. They're making sure that staff who are caregivers, who are working with parents, with children at home, or who are taking care of their own elderly parents and other family members, have the ability to take time off when they need to. There's also this interesting trend we heard around kind of lowering or aligning productivity expectations with what people are facing. We also heard that with Black colleagues in particular, that there needs to be an understanding of the trauma that they're facing, particularly given the systemic racism and police brutality we saw over the summer and continuing, and how that affects them. So how can we create these workplaces where there's a culture of well-being, where there is an emphasis on sustainability, where there's a reality that we're not working in a bubble, that we're actually experiencing a lot of what the communities that we're serving are also experiencing. So really understanding that and responding to that in terms of the way that people's work lives are structured and their workloads are structured too.
And those are also important. We could do a show on any one of these tabs and the things that you're talking about. So first, what has been the reaction? This report just came out a few days ago. Talk about that, please.
Yeah, so it's a very new report. It's gotten, I think, a lot of what I've heard the most, right, which makes me feel good about this report, is that nonprofit leaders of color who read it say, I feel seen. I feel seen in this report. My experiences are reflected here. So that's the most important thing, right? To have the people that you're writing about recognize that this report is of value. Another point that a lot of nonprofit leaders of color are making, which honestly to me is actually rather sad, is that they're saying a lot of the things that we say in this report. But without the data, it's hard for them to make the case, right? And so really recognizing that oftentimes with communities of color, people don't accept what we say, or leaders of color, people don't accept what we say. We have to prove it with data, with talking points, with research, right? And so we really try to imbue that in all of our reports, because it helps then for a nonprofit leader of color in New Mexico or Vegas, as you mentioned earlier, to be able to go to their funder, to be able to go to their policymaker and make a case to say, it isn't just me. We have research, we have reports, we have others saying similar things. We're also finding that philanthropy is taking notice as well of the recommendations that we've made. And so we're hoping that over the course of the next month, we can engage in briefings and presentations and one-on-ones and writing with a lot of the stakeholders that I mentioned earlier to be able to lift up the experiences that we have in this report so that there is change. That's the focus. That's the goal at the end of the day.
We have just a few minutes left with Deepa Iyer. Folks, please share your comments, share your thoughts if you're not work in the nonprofit space, and also a chance to ask her questions about this report. We'll also show the report one more time before we go, because there's an executive summary and there's a full detailed report that people can get. The URL is right on the screen, bit.ly/COVID POC in all caps. Please make sure you get it. And there, Neil has just shared that as well. And Pradnya is going to town, just sharing it everywhere. And Sharmila says, yes, 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 and 2 pluses. So I think that means that's a resounding endorsement of this report. And we want everybody to find this report and share it with friends. And as you said, it's not just because you work in the nonprofit world. It could be because you're supportive of nonprofits. And the American nonprofit sector is so huge. And the headlines and things are taken by the big organizations that raise, hundreds of millions of dollars a year and have big staff. I've worked at places like the Met and others, but one of the most important parts of the nonprofit sector is done by small organizations that work tirelessly with very little support from big donors, and they're doing small donor work and helping people and making a difference in their communities. They're not trying to scale and change the world. They're trying to change their world.
Right. That's so well said. Yes, absolutely. And so listening to and heeding the recommendations from these people of color-led nonprofits is so important. And, folks can also look at different organizations that are putting out reports in Black community, the Native community, and other communities. I want to make a plug for an organization dear to my heart, South Asian Americans Leading Together, SALT, which actually also put out a report just last month looking at the effects of COVID-19 on South Asian communities in the United States. And it's a really powerful report. And so I think the more of this information that we can gather and share, it's important because, as you said, a lot of these perspectives don't get airtime. We're not reading about these communities and these nonprofits in a lot of mainstream media, right? And so I'm grateful to you for giving us the space to have this conversation and hope that folks will share it as much as you can.
Mukul, who's a dear friend and someone who cares a lot about nonprofits, asking, how have nonprofit organizations themselves been affected by the pandemic? Does your report discuss how they're responding?
Yeah, thank you, Mukul. That's a great question. So yes, we found that many of the nonprofit organizations that we surveyed have had to shift their services considerably. So they've had to add, for example, new services that they didn't have before. And so so if you take, for example, an organization that works on gender violence in a particular community, they're also fielding calls about housing instability, about evictions, about the lack of healthy food. So these organizations have had to put into place new services, learn new skills. So they're pivoting, they're adapting to this new environment. And that takes a strain, right? It means you have to shore up and get new skills. It means you have to hire certain types of staff. We also found that a lot of the nonprofits are facing financial instability. Many of the groups we surveyed had received the CARES Act loan that was in place earlier this year, right? But they are concerned about their long-term financial instability. So they talked about the fears that they have. Do they have to lay off staff? Are they going to be able to continue these additional services that they're providing, right? And so there is a financial impact, there's a psychological impact, and there is an impact in terms of programs and activities. These nonprofits are stretched thin, and they're still doing the best that they can with what little they have.
And that is so hard for us to imagine the extra pressure that is happening to these nonprofits when everybody is having pain. Sharmila says, the recommendations for philanthropy are especially invaluable. COVID has completely changed our sector, and the impacts will be felt far after this pandemic may pass. So my appeal to everyone who's watching, who has access to people who give a lot of philanthropy money, to please read this report and please adjust your dollars so that you can give for very specific things in there, including building and supporting leaders of color who need the help right now. And many of the other things that you've asked for and recommended, I think, are very, very important. What surprised you the most, and what did you learn the most about, Deepa?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think that one of the things, I don't know if it surprised me, but it reinforced something for me. You know, I've always believed, and you know this, Sree, I ran a nonprofit for 10 years. Much of my career has been in the nonprofit sector. It's really dear to my heart. And one of the things I've always known is that in nonprofits led by people of color who work in communities of color, we have the solutions. And it wasn't so it was surprising and not, right? That the people that we talked to already knew what their communities needed. And they knew exactly what types of services, what types of policy change needed to be put into place, even in the midst of a crisis. So that was something that was reinforced. And then another part I'll quickly say is, you mentioned this earlier, the optimism. I think that nonprofits led by people of color are straddling two realities, the reality of this pandemic and the social upheavals of 2020, as well as the possibility, you know, the possibility for change, the possibility that we will enter into not back to normal, but a different future. And so that, to me, that optimism that I heard from people in our interviews, really, I think, buttressed me and made me feel that it is possible for us to move through this crisis if we actually listen to nonprofit leaders of color, pay attention to what's happening in their communities, and take heed of their recommendations.
All right. Mukul says, thanks for the wonderful work you're doing. Very inspiring. And so let's remind everyone about the report. They can find it bit.ly/COVID POC. And then I want to do two things before you go. First is I want to show you a headline by Adam Server for a story that he wrote in The Atlantic very early in the pandemic. And it's very clear. It says the coronavirus was an emergency until Trump found out who was dying. The pandemic has exposed the bitter terms of our racial contract, which deems certain lives of greater value than others. Adam was on our show 10 days or 15 days after he wrote this, maybe a little longer. And he talked about this. I said that this is the most important, one of the most important articles of the, you know, of the pandemic. When the pandemic history is written, this article in this moment, you were very much along the same, saying along the lines, these same things. How did you know when so many people were blind to it? By April, you were pointing out that this was a problem.
I think, and yes, I think that this article and this piece is really brilliant for a lot of reasons. I think I knew because, as a lot of other people who work in communities of color knew, because it isn't new, right? That the racial inequities have existed for generations. We've known that in communities of color, people are facing larger levels of homelessness, of job insecurity, of food insecurity, of lack of access to healthcare and basic services. These aren't new trends. These aren't new patterns. Structural racism has existed in this country for generations and generations, and it's particularly affected Black communities and also other communities of color and Native communities. And so this wasn't new. And I think it was a reveal for some. I think COVID-19 was a racial and economic reveal. But I think for a lot of us who work in these communities and study racial inequity and inequality, we knew that this would happen. But I think the disproportionate way in which it has happened is really taking a toll. And as you said, or that article said, the government is not responding in the ways that we need in order for these effects to actually be improved, right? And so we really need all sectors to come together in order to ensure that these disproportionate consequences don't last decades and decades to come.
Thank you. I also want you to, if you could, I think within the South Asian community, there are some people who don't pay enough attention to the issues around Black Lives Matter and about racial justice. Many of them came to this country after college and working good jobs if they were lucky enough to be in that position where they never had to deal with some of the first of all knowing American history and then understanding what it's like that our community stands on the shoulders of Latinos and East Asians and Chinese Americans and Black Americans who did the really hard work to make it possible for us to benefit from the civil rights movement, from the civil rights, from the Voting Rights Act, all kinds of things that we have benefited from. So if you can talk to them, without being political, it's not political to say that you have to understand the value of supporting the folks, supporting Black folks within the South Asian community.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to talk about that a little bit. And you said so much of it, Sree. I think that one of the most important things I've learned and that I would convey is that we are not living in silos, right? We're not just individuals living in nuclear communities, nuclear families. We actually are connected to each other. And I think that is one of the most important ways in which we can understand connections between communities. So I would really urge people to think about who else is in your community, who else is part of your school, who else is part of your workplace, right? It's not just you, it is also others. So it's a starting point of empathy and understanding that we're interconnected. So empathy, interconnectedness are two really important principles to cultivate in our society. And I do think that South Asians, and I would say particularly Indian Americans, have that, right? And we do have that. The second is exactly what you said. We have to learn our history and we have to know it. It is absolutely true that without the Civil Rights Act, there would not have been the Immigration Act of '65 that enabled a lot of people's parents to come here. But this history of solidarity goes well before, it doesn't start in 1965. It's something that actually starts well beyond that with the first pioneers who came to this country. A lot of Bengalis settled in places like Harlem. So I would look at books like Vivek Bald's Bengali Harlem. It's a wonderful book to read to understand the history of solidarity. So empathy, learning our history. And then thirdly, practicing solidarity starts with a simple step. It's a practice, it's a verb. And so if, for example, you can start to, you don't have to, not everybody can go to a protest, right? Not everyone can go to a march. But if you can actually start by educating yourself and then actually educating others. I am so inspired by young people right now, young South Asians who have taken this call, this urgency, right? This moment, this generational moment they're living in, they are having conversations about anti-Black racism within South Asian communities. They are having conversations about colorism. They're having conversations about caste discrimination. They're having conversations about how to actually dismantle all of these systems of oppression. And at the same time, talking about what's happening in their own communities too. So I would say, reach out to folks who are doing some of that work, who are doing some of that writing, learn our histories, commit to our histories, right? And practice empathy. Those are just a few ideas that I would share.
That's beautiful and wonderfully put. Sneha says, Deepa, my cousin shared your article on how South Asians can take action to support Black Lives Matter on a family group chat. I loved it. For anyone who hasn't read it, check out this link. So it's on Medium. And kudos for your heroic work, says Rick. And Rose, who runs hashtag Women to Follow, is live tweeting tonight. I know you haven't had time to retweet us, but I hope you will afterwards and see all the stuff that she and others have been tweeting about you as well. So before we let you go, let's take one more look at the report and just tell everybody where to find it. And also we'll bring it up on screen again. It's bit.ly/COVIDPOC. It's right on your screen right now. And we'll just zoom out and pull back up to the very top so people can see. So it's called On the Frontlines, Nonprofits Led by People of Color Confront COVID-19 and Structural Racism, something that this president has said does not exist in this country. So something every one of his cabinet members, when asked, have said that it doesn't exist. And we all know better than that. You can download the full report, and you can download the executive summary, and you can find the organization that Deepa works for. It's called the Building Movement Project, BLDING Movement, and you can find her at DV Iyer on Twitter, and I'm sure she will tweet it again tonight so that people can find it and get to it. But check out this amazing organization. I'll give you another moment if you'd like to tell people what else Building Movement Project does.
Yeah, so thank you, Sree. Building Movement Project also works on a lot of training. So we do trainings, we do resource generation, we have tools, and we're really interested in making sure that we can assist individuals as well as nonprofits and networks who are interested in social change work, right? We do believe that structural racism exists. We do not think that that is a made up fake news. We think it's real and we know it. And so our goal is to equip nonprofits who are working on structural equity and social change with whatever they need: research, reports, trainings, and resources so that they can do their work so that all of our communities can thrive.
And you're helping people build movements, right? That's what the building...
Social movements and people power are the key to structural change, yes.
Jonathan, who's watched 217 episodes, says this is a fascinating show. Thank you. And Pradnya is still tagging away people. They're going to be watching this for a long time to come. And Ashok, who's in Trivandrum, in Thiruvananthapuram, your hometown, says fascinating work. Looking forward to meeting you in Kerala after the crisis is over. So consider that a direct invitation.
Yes, I would love to accept that invitation. Absolutely.
When was the last time you were in Kerala?
Actually, just a couple of years ago, I was able to visit for a family wedding. But yeah, really do miss it there.
My parents usually watch. Today, my mom's not here, but she'd be thrilled that we had somebody from Kerala, from Trivandrum, because she joins us from Trivandrum. I was there in January, and so sorry that I'm not with her now and with my dad at this moment. But we wish you the very best, Deepa. Thank you for your energy, your insights, your dedication to nonprofits, for the decades of work you've been doing on behalf of your communities around the country that you've been helping. We're so grateful to you. And thank you for joining our show tonight and for letting us tell the story of this very important project. It's called, the report is called On the Frontlines, and the organization is called Building Movement Project. Please check them out online and find out more about the incredible work of Deepa Iyer. She's DV Iyer on Twitter.
Thank you so much, Sree. It's always so good to be in touch with you. And thank you, Vandana and Rose, and thank you everyone for being part of this.
Well, thank you, and we're very grateful. We'll see you again.